G20 leaders have issued a communique clarifying the future direction of the group. The Hangzhou Consensus, as it's known, aims to boost world economic growth through long-term and innovative measures. It also seeks to ensure that developing nations are included in and reap the benefits of globalization. CCTV's Roee Ruttenberg has more.
The G20 final communique starts off by recognizing first and foremost that these are difficult times. Sluggish economic recovery in large parts of the world, potential volatility in financial markets, fluctuations in commodity prices, and slow productivity and employment growth in some countries. There's also the geopolitical reality, an increase in the flow of refugees, and a rise in global terrorism and conflicts. And it's against this backdrop that the G20 members met and committed themselves to boosting trade, to easing barriers that often get in the way of that trade, to fighting against corrupt individuals, and to ensuring that more people are included in global growth. As expected, the communique condemns protectionism. It calls for cooperation in the crackdown on tax evasion, which costs rich members billions in revenues. But for the first time, with China as host, it referenced, quote, the new industrial revolution and the economic potential of the digital age, and specifically stressed the need to include more women, youth, and disadvantaged groups in the process, not just for the sake of inclusion, but as a solution for growth. There was also movement on some sticky issues, such as steel production, or more specifically, overproduction. In the communique, G20 members, China included, recognized that excess capacity in steel, and indeed other industries, was, quote, a global issue which requires collective responses. They also noted that government subsidies in various industries can distort markets and contribute to capacity issues. In terms of steel, the communique announced the creation of a global forum to address those capacity issues, starting with a report due next year. For China, often accused of overproducing, that could be seen as a bit of a give. There's also take, specifically a big issue for Beijing, the fight against corruption. The final communique included the creation of a mechanism for greater cooperation between G20 members in the search for wanted fugitives and their assets. In the past, China has run into obstacles as it went after former officials who fled to places like the US. This would be a natural extension of China's anti-corruption campaign, and one that effectively got bigger wings through this communique. Roee, Ruttenberg, CCTV in Washington.
Well, time now for some analysis on that just concluded summit. We're joined from London by analyst Onyekachi Wambu, of course live for us there in London. Mr. Wambu, the G20 summit has been called a success so far, but tell us more about what the implications are for Africa from the global consensus reached at the G20.
I think there were a number of really good things that came out of the summit. The renewed focus on growth, on global growth, will obviously benefit Africa if the measures that are to be introduced have impact. The focus on inclusion, I think, is a really important point and will benefit Africa. And then the summit seems also to have linked a number of big global agendas in a much more coordinated way. So there was the link to the 2030 SDGs. There was the link to the Addis Ababa finance plan for development, and also a link to the Paris climate agenda. And on the sidelines, obviously, China and the US signed, or China at least signed up to, to the Paris climate agenda, and all of that, I think, will benefit Africa very much. The one thing that I was very impressed by was also the emphasis on renewed better global governance, financial governance, the plans to expand special drawing rights to be more inclusive and more equitable, and also the new Industrial Revolution Action Plan with a big focus on job creation, employment, skills upgrade and also on sort of employment areas.
And of course, Mr. Wambu, as you mentioned, the inclusion being a big focus of this year's G20 summit. And we saw for the first time Africa being better represented at the summit compared to previous years. What does this say about Africa's ability to potentially influence the international economic conversation at a global level?
I think we shouldn't have over sort of imagine the extent to which Africa was included. I mean, there were more African countries invited, but they didn't play central roles. They were there as usual as in a way as supplicants. I think we, in terms of people who were the African countries that were involved as part of the G20, you really only have South Africa. But it was good to see Egypt there. It was good to see the head of the AU and also NEPAD and Senegal and some of the other countries that were there. But I wouldn't overestimate the role that they had to play. Africa will only play a much more meaningful role when our economies are much stronger, when our economies are much bigger, and when as a continent itself we're much more integrated. If we look at the obstacles that are there that are preventing that, we can come and talk about that in a second, that has prevented Africa playing that much more meaningful international role.
And as you say, I mean, if Africa is going to play a more meaningful role, there's much to work on, especially in the context of this particular global economic environment. What does Africa need to do then to be taken more seriously on the global stage?
I think there are a number of things we need to do in terms of improving our own economies. One is that we need to trade more with ourselves on the continent and move much more towards a regime where there's much more internal trade. At the moment, of all the regions in the world, Africa trades least with itself, and it seems to me that you can't be expecting others to trade much more effectively with you when you're not doing the same with yourself. So we need to look at the things that we can trade with each other, reduce the tariffs and other barriers that are in place so that we can do that much more effectively. We need also to have our economies be much more driven internally, and that means we need external investment, but we also need to have a better savings regime so that our own savers drive our own economy and our own savers become the investors in our own economy. So measures need to be put in place to encourage investment. We need better coordination with our citizens that are outside the continent and also the descendants of Africans outside the continent who want to invest. I'm talking here about the diaspora. At the moment, they are sending about 65 billion to the continent. How can we better structure those amounts going in so that instead of going into consumption, they're going into investment? And then we need to be looking really at better, I guess, infrastructure development on the continent. So that the roads, the power generation, all these things that are really presenting the barriers against industrialization are removed. It seems to me that we need a real agenda around that, and I think the G20 summit would help in some respects of that. The industrialization, the emphasis on the industrialization policy would help Africa in those respects. But I think also the emphasis on growth will help enormously. The things that we trade at the moment are commodities. They've taken a massive hit. If you look at the oil sector, if you look at things like the mineral sector, in Zambia, copper, they've taken a massive hit because those countries that were importing quite a lot over the last 15 years, China and others, have importing much less because of the fact that they can't in themselves re-export this because the leading economies are the growth in the leading economies are so low. So the emphasis on growth is very, very important for the continent as well. But as I said, we have a whole number of other things that are within our power to address: savings, better internal trade on the continent, better investment in our infrastructure. Those things we can be doing ourselves while we get additional support from the G20.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that analysis, Mr. Onyekachi Wambu, live for us there in London on the G20 summit and what it means for Africa.